Thank you very much for joining us today at lunchtime on October 25th. My name is Eric Howard. I'm the new Executive Director of the E2 Tech Council. I'm joined here today by Jackie Baker and Matt Nixon. Jackie is the Council's new Clean Tech and Policy Manager, and it's her third week. It's my third month. And so we're excited to be spending time meeting members, prospective members, people who live in Maine, people who live in other parts of the country, and perhaps even abroad. Our speaker today is Matt Nixon, and we'll be introducing him in a few moments. To give a little background on E2 Tech, I have a couple slides, and then I'll be passing the baton over to Matt. So E2 Tech has been around for 21 years. Our focus is environmental, energy, and sustainability. We work with businesses, nonprofits, governments, individuals. Today, you'll see in the background behind me, not a particularly exciting wall. I'm in the conference room at TRC, which is an international engineering company, one of our member firms on Marginal Way in Portland. Other important partners for our webinars and in-person events are Maine Biz, the magazine that's distributed online as well as in paper to members and businesses all over the region. And then our other annual sponsor is the Maine Technology Institute, which every year provides millions of dollars in funding to small, emerging, as well as larger businesses to support technology innovation in the state in 7 technology sectors. And 2 of those 7 sectors are environment and aquaculture. And so today's program is a nice overlap between 2 of the Maine Technology Institute's focus areas. What we do as an organization is we convene meetings. We're a catalyst. We also do some research on behalf of the state of Maine and some other groups. And then we are a connector. We do approximately 25 or so gatherings every year. Some of those are virtual, like today. Some of them are in person. We cover many parts of the economy, whether it be environmental protection, grid, energy issues, aquaculture, offshore wind, also solar, regional planning, architecture, and various other aspects of environment and sustainability, as well as energy. We have a diversity statement saying that we are very interested in supporting all different aspects of the Maine economy. We're also working on ways to bring people from other parts of the country to Maine as a way to support economic development in Maine. We have about 20 members on our board of directors, which meets monthly. We very much appreciate their support. They cover as many different aspects of the environment and energy community. You can see their names there. And if you go to the e2tech.org website, you can see their full bios. We do have some upcoming meetings. Again, the board meets once a month. Our next board meeting's on November 9th here in Portland. We have a winter social annual meeting, which is on December 6th in Portland at Baxter Academy. Jackie and I were there this morning looking at the facility and meeting with the staff to think about how to have a wonderful program. We'll probably have a silent auction. Traditionally, it's a pizza and beer kind of gathering with 100 to 125 people. So we hope to have at least 100 and maybe 125 people in early December. The council also does a legislative gathering in Augusta at the beginning of the year. This year it'll be on February 1st with members from the House and the Senate on committees relating to energy and environment, perhaps also housing or transportation, because those are also big issues right now in the Maine environmental community. We have some sustaining members. As you can see their logos here. We also have sustaining stewards who contribute slightly smaller amounts of money, but also very, very important in terms of our program support. You can see many of their logos. I know that some of these firms were going to be represented at the meeting today. I think there was someone from LSP Power in Ramble. I don't know if they're joining us or not, but those are some of our sustaining members. And then we have, as you saw on the earlier slide, hundreds of other businesses who are just regular members and aren't making additional contributions. Here we are, our logo, our website down in the lower left, and our telephone number if you'd like to reach Jackie or me with thoughts or questions, if you want to invite us to something going on in your community. Also thinking about doing some factory tours or site visits of interesting projects that our members have done. Matt said that maybe at some point in 2024, we can come out to Topsham and see what he's doing in person. So now I'd like to pass the baton over to Matt and let him tell us about aquaponics and the work that he's been working on for the last few years. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you, Eric. I appreciate the introduction. And I'd first like to thank E2 Tech and their programs board and the rest of the executive board for inviting me to this great opportunity. It's very much welcome. E2 Tech is a fantastic organization. I've been aware of their work for quite some time now in the state, and I'm not aware of other organizations in other states that do quite the same type of networking that E2 Tech does and is known for. So thank you again. My name is Matt Nixon, and to the rest of you, I'd like to thank you for spending some of your valuable time this fine day. It's not super cold out, though it is kind of cloudy. I'm the owner and founder of Muddy River Farm Aquaponics. I'm also a consultant with several private and public sector contracts ranging from marine resource assessments, etc. And finally, I'm an offshore energy project manager at the best darn environmental consulting firm in Maine, Tetra Tech. Before venturing into the private sector, I was the deputy director of the Maine Coastal Zone Management Program for over a decade, where I worked in offshore wind policy and siting. I founded the state seafloor mapping program, and I oversaw several grant programs, including the Shore and Harbor Planning Grant, Coastal and Estuarine Land Conservation, and for a time, the Working Waterfront Access Protection Program. I resigned in 2019 in order to spend more time with my family, ease my jaded cynicism, complete my PhD program at UMaine, with the subject of today's presentation also being the focus of my dissertation, and of course, start the company in November of 2019, which was a truly spectacular time to start a business, given what happened 3 months later. So here is the gist of what we do. The key take-homes are that we try to find sustainable solutions to climate change issues in the marine environment. Personally, I'm of the belief that we missed our chance in the 90s to reverse many of the larger impacts. The best we can do at this point is slow and blunt the changes and, of course, adapt, which is what growing oysters on land is all about. One of the questions I get over and over from friends, colleagues, and peers alike is why grow oysters in the backyard? What's the benefit? Isn't it more expensive than the ocean? I'd like to spend a small amount of time answering that question before we get into the meat of the discussion. Over the past 5 or so years, I'm pretty sure every environmental nonprofit in the state of Maine, in addition to our academic community, has used this quote at the top of the screen in their grant applications and presentation materials. As a UMaine professor once said to me, it's all about the period in which you investigate. The longer the period, the better, obviously. In this case, the 10-year period is not incredibly long, especially geologically speaking, but it still tells a compelling story. The Gulf of Maine has been warming considerably over the past decade, and the resulting impacts on not just the ecosystem, but the commercially viable species it contains have been well documented. The Gulf of Maine has broken temperature records every summer since 2019. Warmer water leads to explosions in all types of invasive species, including green crabs that have devastated our softshell clam industry. Substantial rain events, which are typically more acidic than the ocean water they run off into, are far more prevalent and impact levels of PCO2 and subsequently pH in our coastal environments, which inhibits the growth of organisms that rely on the availability of calcium in the water to make their shells. And we rely on a lot of organisms that use calcium in their shells in this state for economic purposes, but also just for eating and sustenance. This in turn impacts industries ranging from traditional lease aquaculture to the lobster industry. Since I began working in my work in coastal marine resource management in Maine in 2008, the epicenter of the lobster industry hasn't moved necessarily. It's remained in Stonington. But communities down east, meaning farther up the coast towards the Canadian Maritimes, for those of you not from Maine, have begun appearing in the top 10 ports by volume with much greater frequency. In fact, Jonesport topped Stonington in 2021 for landings by pound. The lobster industry is Maine's coastal linchpin. It drives nearly every aspect of the state's coastal policy and marine development. It's also the lifeblood of dozens of small coastal Maine towns, with the importance to municipal solvency growing the farther east one goes. Without lobsters, these communities would have a very hard time existing as they currently are. Their entire economies are based on this type of resource. Regardless of how sustainable the industry may be, the fact that remains that baby lobsters don't particularly care for warm, acidic water. Climate change doesn't really care about sustainable practices. And that's just what climate change is delivering to the Gulf of Maine. Several departments at UMaine, in addition to a number of nonprofit organizations throughout the state, have focused with varying degrees of success on not on retraining, but on assisting wild harvesters in diversifying their portfolio of bringing in additional revenue. While aquaculture in the ocean has a brighter future than, say, cod or the Gulf of Maine shrimp industry, it's still susceptible to the same climate change-induced chemical and physical changes taking place in the world's oceans that are, for the most part, beyond our control at this point. In addition to climate change impacts, shellfish harvesting, whether it's wild harvest or cultured, is becoming more polarizing every year in Maine. Maine is one of 7 states in the U.S. that still maintains a low tide ownership law, meaning the upland owner owns everything to the low tide mark. That's not the case in the majority of coastal states in the United States. This low tide ownership law can make it difficult for wild harvesters like clammers or wormers to actually get down to the resource because a lot of folks don't necessarily like to see those people crossing their property, and sometimes they'll post it unless there's a lot of history of using that particular area to get down to the flats. With regards to aquaculture, as the state holds the submerged lands of Maine, which is everything from that low tide mark out to 3 nautical miles, in trust for the people of the state, if one wants to start an aquaculture company, one has to apply for a lease from the state for a certain acreage of water. The lease process, which can include public hearings, can open up a veritable Pandora's box of legal roadblocks, bureaucracy, financial hurdles, and certain groups who like to jump into the fray. Upland riparian neighbors, as I mentioned, don't always like to see cages or allow harvesters to cross their land. More dominant fisheries in Maine also don't like to compete for space, which is understandable. For shellfish species that literally clean the water as they eat, it's a hard pill to swallow that shellfish aquaculture is a bad thing for the state. I'm a pragmatist, and after having a front row seat to regulators sticking their heads in the sand and hoping that some of these problems would go away by themselves for too long, I decided to put my money where my mouth was. In the world of coastal policy, the term resilience gets thrown around a lot. I had a good friend who developed an equation for one of the courses I was teaching at the University of Southern Maine at one point regarding resiliency. And it was abatements, mitigation, adaptation, plus persistence equals resilience. My thought process began there. So I sought to mitigate the environmental limiting factors fluctuating water temperatures, trending warmer, acidification, invasives, and increased pathogens in an attempt to both develop a profitable business model for proof of concept and to help prepare our coastal communities for what seems inevitable at this point. So in addition to standard rainbow trout and lettuce aquaponics production, which I do in the barn in my backyard, my company decided to look at growing oysters in the backyard in a controlled environment, which essentially gets us around almost all the aforementioned environmental limiting factors. In the summer of 2021, the Maine Technology Institute funded my company to conduct an industry-wide survey of small shellfish aquaculturists and dealers, attempting to quantify issues that were impacting their bottom line and how our work might help them in the long run, rather than only relying on anecdotal evidence. What we found was quite interesting and very encouraging. We conducted over 33 hours worth of interviews and then spent 3 months quantifying that qualitative data. In the end, the three biggest margin impacting issues were the cost of aquaculture gear, the cost of labor, and the availability of seed. Maine has a seasonal aquaculture industry, as do most northern latitude states. In the winter, companies either pull their product and throw it in a freezer or sink their cages, and their product goes dormant due to the temperature in the water column and the lack of food. This means they have approximately 5 to 6 months to work their butts off for a return on investment. It takes approximately 3 years for an oyster to go from spat to market on a traditional aquaculture lease, and this is again because of that seasonality that's introduced because of the winter. Take into account a 20 to 30% rate of product loss for various reasons, and your margin can become kind of thin at times, unless you increase your volume, which requires more labor, which is far and away the largest cost to any aquaculture company. It's a sort of this heinous catch-22. On top of this doom loop, consider that it takes anywhere from 2 to 4 years for a shellfish aquaculture farm to get a permit to scale up from what's called an LPA, or small experimental lease. It doesn't even take that long for a full-blown federal NEPA review on a commercial scale offshore wind farm. So it's kind of crazy at times. In light of these issues, uncovered in our market survey, MRF decided to look at ways in which we could fill in that winter gap, that loss of growth, in an attempt to give farmers a leg up in May or March, whenever they decide to choose, or whenever they choose to bring their cages up from the bottom. Instead of starting from scratch, they'd have a crop of nearly mature product that could then season, quote unquote, on their lease for a month or so and have a product for sale dramatically earlier than normal, which of course helps everyone. If product growth wasn't their cup of tea, MRF also offers both cold storage and wet storage, the former involving the renting of space in the company's freezers, because a lot of farms can't afford a walk-in, or they don't have the space for it, or the latter, which involves storage in a recirculating controlled environment water tanks that keep the temperature below the point where oysters go dormant. So that way they'd essentially be doing the same thing they'd be doing in the cages offshore, except they'd be in a controlled environment. Continuing to riff on the winter growth, we started putting together ideas for a saltwater recirculation system disconnected from the ocean and its unpredictable nature. In the 1980s, some kook in Australia determined that force-feeding oysters algae made them open their shells more than usual. It also made them grow quickly, as there are only 3 things that detract from an oyster's energy budget: feeding, they suck water in and expel it, they're filter feeders; gonad production; and meat growth. If you can remove the first 2 from the equation, all you're left with is growth. Couple that with the benefits of a dramatically decreased likelihood of product loss due to environmental factors and predation, and the foundation of a profitable business model begins to take shape. So the next step was obviously operationalizing the ideas. In a conversation with a member of my dissertation committee, who is also an employee of UMaine's Advanced Structures and Composites Center, I was complaining about the cost of building an indoor system made from cement, steel, and glass. And this was before COVID inflation. In the ocean, oyster farming does not require electricity, chilling, heating, or feed for that matter, which means the system in question needs to make up for those overhead increases through reduced labor costs, production, volume, and minimal expenses for manufacturing the grow-out gear. In this case, the recirculating system itself. My colleague's immediate reaction was, we should print that, which is where Oak Ridge National Labs technology collaboration comes into play. Working with UMaine through a Cooperative Research and Development Agreement, a CRADA, funded by the U.S. Department of Energy, enabled Muddy River Farm to get access to the exceptional engineers at the Advanced Structures and Composites Center, in addition to extremely valuable time on their 3D printer. After pitching the idea to the Maine Technology Institute, we were able to secure a level 1 investment grant to pay for my time and my staff's time for the first phase of the project. UMaine's I-Corps program was instrumental in pulling my head out of its 11 years of bureaucratic tendencies and helping me think like an entrepreneur. And of course, there was a lot of bootstrapping and several algae population explosions in the tank before we perfected the feeding regime. There are a couple of other sources on this slide. AMLF is the Agricultural Market and Loan Fund offered by the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. Mid-Coast Council of Governments is one of many different types of regional councils in the state that provides a variety of different services, in this case, some financing. And I-Corps is a division of the National Science Foundation. It essentially assists scientists in becoming more business savvy, which was helpful, to say the least. In August of 2020, the Advanced Structures and Composite Center was able to print 3 pods, that's what we're calling them, prototypes, after an enormous amount of back and forth and design tweaking. It was quite the process, watching this kind of loony idea go from concept to spliced blueprints as a result of UMaine's engineers and their ability to make a far-out concept a reality. The pod is made from bioplastics and forest industry byproducts. In Maine, we lose a paper mill every year, or excuse me, not every year, every 5 years or so. And the need for finding alternative uses for their harvest, for the forest harvest, is becoming more critical every year. The ASCC does an incredible job in trying to address that issue. And here in this slide, you can see printed product on the forklift for size comparison, and that's the bottom of the printer on the bottom right corner. A system is premised on principles of vertical agriculture. Going vertical allows the system to only need 1 pump and 1 heater chiller. The prototype pods were suspended above this big green tank that I found in the back lot of one of UMaine's aquaculture facilities. I'm told it was used to rear salmon in the 80s. It serves as both a sump and as a photobioreactor, meaning once I introduce Tetraselmis algae to the system, the food supply becomes somewhat self-sufficient. I also only need to control the temperatures in the sump as opposed to each individual pod. So for the first 60 days after printing, we tested the pod, making sure that the material it was made from was not going to impact water quality, leach anything into the water, because again, oysters are filter feeders, and anything that's in that water is going to wind up in their stomach. And to make sure the pod didn't degrade and fall apart in salt water. I conducted a full battery of water quality tests that included basic parameters like DO, pH, salinity, turbidity. In addition, the water has been tested twice now by an outside lab for solvents or residual chemicals that may impact oyster quality. Given the safety data sheets for the materials used in production, Tecmer PLA and wood flour, I didn't expect to find much, if anything, that might derail the effort to use the materials in a saltwater recirculation system. A target pH of between 7.8 and 8.3 was desirable as it mimics the pH of seawater. Lower levels of pH limit the supply of calcium needed for expedited shell growth and shell growth in general. Additional key parameters included in monitoring because of their endemic nature to seawater and their impact on shellfish growth included phosphorus, nitrate, and carbonate and bicarbonate. I used in my prototype a mix called reef crystals, which is typically used for coral reef aquariums. It's explicitly made without the addition of phosphorus and nitrate. So subsequently, no detectable levels were found in the water. Good stuff. Carbonate was measured at 190 parts per million, which is slightly higher than average seawater, but makes sense given the intended use of the mix. Several metals, including zinc, iron, copper, and manganese, were observed, all at very small concentrations. All of these parameter values are within, and in some cases, lower than predicted ranges, again, predicated on the mix that was used. Some additional pics of testing showing the suspension of the prototype pod, the aerators at full power underneath the pod, daily salinity measurement, and the latest water quality reports. Prior to the introduction of oysters, a number of physical measurements at several points in the pod structure were taken to again verify the material was not degrading, but also to ensure the material wasn't absorbing water, swelling, or deforming. Some results from the initial measurements are included here. Structurally speaking, no measurable difference was detected at any of the 8 points measured on the pod. Table 1 here shows measurements taken with digital calipers just prior to the prototype being suspended in the salmon tank, and then measurements taken 30 days afterwards. Points D, E, and F were located directly above the aerators and showed no signs of material loss. Good news. After testing was complete and we understood that the pod was not a dead end, it was time to rig it with PVC and get to growing. As I mentioned before, the premise is to force feed small oysters. It's a bad way to put it, but it's true. It was anywhere in size from 4 to 12 millimeters, a steady diet of Tetraselmis algae at a high water velocity while making sure the water temps didn't get above 62 degrees, which would result in a lot of baby oysters, and I was not really interested in that. The discharge manifold of each pod's grow bay is modeled on the interior baffles of a landscape waterfall nozzle, like something you might find in a waterfall in someone's backyard, that Maine cut in half with a bandsaw and replicated the design in the printer's splicing software. Here, you can see the pod before addition of the oysters running at about 1,300 RPM, variable speed, or using one variable speed hot tub full pump. This is after the addition of product. My business model relies on buying small product from Maine farms in the fall, growing the product to sub-market size over the winter, or storing it, depending on what they choose, and then selling the product back to the small farm for a few extra dimes per piece. My intent is to serve as a value-added service rather than competing directly with the industry that I see as having a huge role to play in Maine's coastal economy's future. Volume really comes into play here, but based on calculations, including depreciation, pod cost, labor, electricity, feed expenses, and product loss, the ROI is pretty stellar. Even though the oysters do clean the water, it's still important to keep the water clear of any type of bacteria, other nastiness. These are the support systems I use to make sure the water doesn't become too green, which can happen if the Tetraselmis has too much of a party in the tank. These are all pretty much homemade DIY filtration systems. Those are repurposed Kalamata olive drums, one for essentially getting waste to settle on the bottom, and the other one is for removing nitrogen from the water. In clockwise order, I also have a UV filtration system hooked up for water clarity. And then there's the hot tub pump that runs the whole show on the bottom right. After design, testing, numerous trips to Orono, hauling large, odd objects in my trailer down 95, lots of anxiety, and one heck of a how I spent my COVID story for the grandkids. We scaled up the pod earlier this year and printed the first commercial size systems. There were several tweaks that were made to the discharge manifold, as the prototype had identified a couple of dead zones in each grow bay where oysters weren't necessarily receiving as much feed as the other oysters in the grow bay were. To verify those tweaks, Maine developed a computational fluid dynamic model. Some of the results you can see here on the screen. We also added a drainage channel to each grow bay to decrease the amount of PVC needed and to make the pod more plug and play. A full pod array is capable of holding about 20,000 oysters, and I hope to have 100 arrays operating soon. So where might all these pods fit? Certainly not in the barn. In early 2023, I began working with the city of Bath to purchase a municipally owned 200-year-old, 3-story, 15,000 square foot monstrosity in the North End. While it's old, the city dropped about $3 million in EDA grant funding into structural rehabilitation about 6 years ago, so it's pretty solid. The bones are good. It's kind of ugly, although that is changing. It's huge and incredibly unique. Since April of this past spring, 3 diligent staff have been making the building less ugly, far more functional, and prepped to pass a USDA and DMR inspection for upland oyster production. Maine has been cranking out pods in partnership with a large-scale additive manufacturing company out of Ohio, as the ASCC uses their printer for other things like houses, which can get in the way of printing small things like my pod. Ultimately, I'd like to begin licensing the pod and method to smaller farms who might not have a ton of space or room for a walk-in freezer, but additional investment will be needed before that can happen. Here's a little bit more of the interior coming along. We've got a large bank of pods waiting to get installed. It's a really neat place, and quite enjoying my time in the city of Bath, and they've been extremely welcoming. A presentation like this would not be complete without a I could not have done this without you, Slide. Organizations who have invested time, funding, encouragement, knowledge, and a heck of a lot of support are listed here. One of UMaine's key players, Susan McKay, who served as project manager for phase one of the pod's development, is also on this call and definitely merits a shout out. MRF is currently in the midst of acquiring considerable seed production capacity that will not only assist other farms, as there are very limited seed options in Maine, as mentioned earlier, but it will also provide my company with all the seed it needs for product maturation at the Bath facility. Here's a bit of look at the market. This isn't just a New England thing. There's a lot of stuff going on nationwide, especially down in the Gulf, where entire coasts are being shut down. So a lot of times in the southern latitudes, you don't have the seasonality that we do in Maine, but you have other issues that impact your ability to grow, and that could be a shutdown. It could be 103-degree water off the southern coast of Florida this year, a variety of different things. The market is pretty exceptional for this use, even with conservative estimates of half of the U.S. market. With that said, that's my presentation. This is an aerial view of the prototype operating full capacity. Well, not full capacity, but in testing mode. There's quite a few pipes going every which way, and that should do it.
So thank you very much, Matt. If you can stop sharing your screen, then we can see the larger number of people. If folks wish to let themselves be seen, you can turn on your screen or you can hide behind your name, whatever you want. As I said, this is a meeting, not a webinar, so we have the ability to see folks' names. I'm going to start out with the first question for Matt, which is, can you tell us a little bit more about why you chose to go into this particular business line as part of your dissertation research and as a business opportunity for yourself and for the state of Maine?
Sure. As hokey as this is going to sound, I have two small daughters at home, and having sat with the state of Maine for as long as I did, you sort of get this general idea as to what trends are, what reactions from agencies are going to be, and where policy may or may not go. And eventually, if you're there long enough, you come full circle back to something that was an idea 10 years ago that has suddenly reemerged as a new idea. So I think in summary, I got into this because I want to not only support the constituents I used to have with the state, and I worked with quite a few fishermen up and down the coast, but also to make sure that my daughters can appreciate the ocean environment the way I grew up with it, which I don't think is going to necessarily be the case. But I wanted to be able to say that I did the best that I could when the time comes in the future, and we're in a bad spot.
In the shorter term, so let's say the next 5 years, is one of your hopes to be providing seeds to other farmers who are still able to grow oysters here in Maine?
That's correct. Eventually.
Yeah. And at the same time, theoretically, this could also be a full-scale production system?
Except for the quote-unquote last mile. The people buy certain types of oysters for basically based on geography because of the salinity content of those oysters and the different flavor. Some say there's no difference in flavor. I think there is. But the last mile there, they still have to go out in the ocean to take on that particular flavor of that particular embayment, which is why at the end of the production period, the farm takes them back and puts them back out on their lease.
Okay. So the farmer might put them in the water for 3 months or 6 months or whatever.
Limits exposure, and it also gives them a decent size. It gives them a better ability to predict their budget for the coming year, essentially.
Okay, good. I know that Susan McKay has turned on her video, and so I can see her. And Matt, you called her out during your presentation. She's at the University of Maine in Orono. And I'm wondering if Susan would like to give some feedback from her side of the project as one of the partners who helped get this thing going. And you have to
on the spot, Susan.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. I'm happy to. He's got a few more questions to cover, but yeah, just saying that the program that funded Matt's work was funded by the Department of Energy, and it enables us at the Composite Center and other parts of the University of Maine to leverage DOE funds to partner with industry directly in advancing the use of bio-based materials as well as large format additive manufacturing. Matt was our first ever technical collaboration, and he's done an amazing job. Exceeded everyone's, well, not expectations, but wildest dreams, because that's exactly what we want to accomplish with this program. It's what the Department of Energy and Oak Ridge piloted and developed this process at their manufacturing demonstration facility. And it's a way to use these funds to pay for the R&D time of at the university side, while the private company just matches it. And so Matt did all the hard work. We did the fun work, and the result is a very innovative land-based vertical growing system that's quite unique, and at the same time ticks all the boxes that we're looking to do, which is decarbonize manufacturing. So that's pretty much all I need to say.
Okay, thank you.
It was a nice job, Matt. So.
Yeah, Matt, I think you can also, like the rest of us, see what's going on in the chat function. A couple of people have asked about the size of the oysters that are going in or coming out of your system. Like how big are they before they go out for that last mile?
So I can't put seed in the system quite yet. Just too small. Anything up to about 4 millimeters and below, excuse me, is pretty tiny for this system anyway. But anything between 4 and 12 is the ideal sweet spot for that initial installation into the system. And then depending on what the farmer wants, and this is all spelled out in a contract prior to me receiving the product, then I'll aspire to grow their product to the size that they'd like. I mean, some farms like petites, some like larger oysters. So it's all dependent on what that farmer would like to see at the end of the winter grow out period.
Right. And you're providing a service, and the farmer maintains ownership of the oyster?
Yes and no. So as a way of relieving some potential, like let's say there was a fire in the building and lost everything. There are very, very few options right now for any type of aquaculture insurance, period. And what options are out there are insanely expensive. So my model relies on me buying that product from them. This is all, again, spelled out in a contract for a smaller price, growing it out during the winter, and then selling it back. So that way, all of the risk is on me at that point to make sure that the product survives throughout the grow period.
And so you're gonna accept that risk.
Yeah, because I'm confident in the technology.
Yeah, or I should say your investors will accept that risk. Yeah.
Right.
Are there issues in terms of crossing state lines?
No, I mean, right now I'm just working with Maine.
Yep.
That's my main target. If there's a host of permits that might be needed, and I think James Becker's face is right next to mine on the screen right now. So I mean, he would know better than I. But even for exporting seed, for instance, some states have regulations, some don't. Sometimes you can get approved as easily as just submitting an application to a Marine Resource Agency in a particular state. Other times, other states, it's just not even necessary. You don't have to be in a pre-approved list. So it's really, it varies state to state.
Yeah. Yep. George was curious about what you're using to feed them.
Right now, I'm using frozen algae paste. Mook Sea Farm, which is another hatchery in the Damariscotta, used to create a paste similar to this. I haven't seen it offered for sale for a bit now, so I've been having to purchase mine from a company out in Utah, which the the seed is fairly cheap, or excuse me, the paste is cheap. It's the shipping costs to get it here under 24 hours. That is the real pain in the butt. In the future, I think there's going to be a lot more algae production in the state. I know I intend to install some photobioreactors on my second floor to essentially create my own feed. But until that happens, shipping in concentrated frozen algae is the most economic means to feed them.
So you said that the oysters sort of go to sleep in the winter when it's cold. Do you have any contracts right now for taking care of oysters for this coming winter? It's October 25th, so winter's coming soon.
Oh, the building is still being put together.
Some places just had their first frost last night.
I know, you're telling me about it. The building is still being put together. I may buy some seed myself and start in putting it in the system probably next month. I've still got a bunch of tanks coming in from New Brunswick that are needed for support systems. And at this point, given some delays in getting the building under control, I'll probably be growing my own product this winter and then transitioning to the services. That isn't to say the freezers and the wet storage, traditional wet storage, won't be available. But in terms of marketing, I've done none of that yet because Mr. Becker needs to get into my building first to take a look.
So perhaps this winter you'll also be getting a flavor in terms of what it actually costs to run the building. And then
the new building, yes.
Like, what's the cost of electricity? What's the cost for heat? Figuring out whether you want to put up solar systems so that you can use renewable power. Those kinds of questions. That's all.
Yeah, that's number one of my priorities, electricity management. I have a full plan for a solar build out on the roof of the building already, with additional arrays in the back. And I actually received a grant from the Mid-Coast Council of Governments to help get that started. It's definitely needed. I mean, the electricity rates continue to go up every single year. And this thing is also still heated with 2 oil burning furnaces in the cellar. So that's obviously not a place that I want to be. So there's a company that'll be outfitting the building with heat pumps this winter. So that way I'll have the first and second floor completely driven by electricity, which in turn will be driven by the small solar farm on my roof.
Okay.
But yes, I mean, the finding that sweet spot for overhead was a key task early on in the development of this product, because like I mentioned in the presentation, you don't need electricity in the ocean. So you need to be able to make sure that the electricity you do use isn't cutting into your bottom line, your return on investment. And the design of the system is such that it's literally meant to decrease electricity use. So, I mean, what you might see in a normal stacked cold storage facility are a number of different pumps of pretty significant size, pumping water up 1 or 2 stories, and then letting it trickle back down. In this particular case, that type of energy usage is minimized to a pretty small pool pump per array. And then, like I said, the sump itself is what contains the water that's going up to the top. So that's the only part of the tank that actually needs to be kept at temperature.
Yep. James, Matt mentioned you a couple of times. Do you want to unmute yourself and add something to this conversation? Are you willing to do so?
Sorry, James.
If someone else wants to add some thoughts, please either raise their hand or put something in the chat.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, that was a fantastic presentation, Matt. As you know, I've been interested and eager to see what's going on. I look forward to coming over to check it out, but I'll introduce myself. I work for the Department of Marine Resources, and I run a shellfish dealer inspection program. And we're now inheriting all the land-based aquaculture in the state of Maine. These require inspections to make sure these facilities like Matt's meet FDA regulations and state regulations for sanitation and regulation. And like Matt had said a few times, I'll be coming down there when he's ready. We spoke on the phone, I believe, last week. And whenever he's ready, we'll come down and we'll look at the sanitation of the water, how it is handled. It's going to be, I think this will be quite a fascinating first of its kind sort of setup in Maine. But if anybody has any like more detailed questions, you can reach me on you can see us on our website on the Maine Department of Marine Resources. Just look up my name. But Matt and I will be definitely doing some lots of talking, and I look forward to this. It looks absolutely fascinating. Way to go. Very good. So yeah.
Yep.
Thanks, James. Sorry about that.
Yeah, there's another Matt on this call, Matt Parker, who's posted a couple of questions.
Yeah, I'm looking at those right now.
Yeah, and so do you have any answers to those? I said, since you could read them, I'm not going to say them out loud.
Yes, so there is tumbling involved. Brittle shell is absolutely something that is out there for sure, especially if they grow too quickly. So tumbling, I have a tumbling machine already in Bath, so there'll definitely be tumbling. 100 pods without grant money. We did this equation, Susan, I think it was like $300 or something like that, if there's printer capacity. Which is another question mark in and of itself that I believe UMaine's currently working on. But this is a large product, and it requires printers that are typically larger than what you might find in a regular mom and pop, quote unquote, printing shop.
$300 total for 100 pods.
Oh, for 100 pods? No, it's $300 per pod.
Sorry, that's why I spoke up that to clarify.
Yeah, that's a big one. And you also asked about sanitation issues. So prior to receiving product in the facility, my protocol is to have it tested by Kennebec River Biosciences first, keep it in quarantine in a tank inside the facility itself for about a month, or excuse me, for about 2 weeks to see if there's any impacts, have the product tested again after the end of the 2 weeks, put it into the system, and that at the end of the system, and this is mostly related to state regulations as well, the meat has to be tested, the water quality has to be tested at a certain schedule, and you have to have all those records on hand in the event of an inspection.
Well, my question with that was, if you're not selling direct to the public for consumption, you're selling to go back on the farm, why do you have to deal with shellfish sanitation issues when they can just sit on the farm for 2 weeks to purge out before the farmer sells them for public human consumption?
Well, if I bring something into my system,
well, that's different. That's biosecurity, not shellfish sanitation.
Okay.
Shellfish sanitation is pretty specific when it comes to selling oysters to the public. And if you don't pass the shellfish sanitation guidelines, you're not able to sell to the public for consumption, but you're not selling to the public for consumption. So that should eliminate the need for that. You're basically operating a shellfish nursery.
Glorified wet storage.
Yeah. And if you're selling them below the market size back to the farmer for that quote final mile, then why do you have to deal with shellfish sanitation?
I've never really separated the two terms, but I want to make sure that my product is clean when it leaves the facility. Even if it does go back out in the water, if there's something in, I know you said it was biosecurity, but if there's something in that tank that then makes it out into the cages, it's just not something I want being traced back to my business. So
I'm not going to go argue definitions, but that's a little bit different thing than what shellfish farmers refer to for shellfish sanitation is a little different than what you're talking about. So it's good to get that clarified. And just for your,
I wouldn't say in general. I mean, I think maybe some shellfish farmers that you're familiar with do that, but some that I'm familiar with also refer to them as one and the same. So I think, again, we won't argue definitions.
And just for your information, my background is I've been dealing with aquaculture, business planning, economics for 20 years. The last 12 years specializing in shellfish, aquaculture production and did my dissertation on aquaculture farming business economics. And I really like your tank. I think that's really cool. It could have lots of applications. It's 3D printed for the aquaculture world, especially since they're fairly inexpensive compared to others. And thank you for clarifying, because when I first saw an article about you and saw this webinar, I thought you were doing a full-on production system. So knowing that it's not a full-on production system, I had to change my questions just a little bit, because someone mentioned, could oysters be grown indoors? And yes, you can grow oysters fully indoors. However, at the scale you would need to be profitable, it's not really economical for people to do. So this is a little bit different. So I tailored my questions a little bit more. But I like to say, I really think that your tank is really cool and has a variety of issues, or not issues, but opportunities for aquaculture, given your water testing and stuff like that you did.
Thank you, Matt. I was curious about this last question that Brad put up, which is there any intellectual property here? And you've just shown us lots of pictures, which makes it now in the public domain. But were there some patents that you were applying for, or have applied for, or is potentially patentable that you didn't show pictures of?
That's correct. Well, there's also half of it is the method as well. So working with universities, Department of Industrial Cooperation, or whatever it's called now, I think it has a different name. But they've been helping me with the patent process. It's obviously in their best interest as well, to make sure that one of their projects makes it through. But yes, there is IP involved. Pictures I'm not too worried about. You'd have to really scratch your head for a while to figure out what I'm doing with this stuff.
Yeah,
but it's a good point.
And if the water in the Gulf of Maine is too warm in the summer, I presume that having an unair conditioned building in the summer is also too warm, that the oysters wouldn't be happy when it's 85 degrees inside your building.
Oh, the building is air conditioned.
And so your building is air conditioned down to the appropriate cold temperatures? So that's
correct.
In the summer.
Yep, everything's kept at 55 on the first and second floor. The tanks in the bottom in the cellar, which is where all the mixing tanks happen, those are kept at an even lower temperature.
Okay.
But I mean, to their point, I mean, once we get to that threshold where water temperature is too warm on a much more frequent basis than it is currently, the transition to indoor is going to have to happen. It's just a matter of time at this point.
Okay.
Full indoor production, excuse me.
Yep.
So someone's going to have to figure out how to make that economical.
Right. This is scheduled for an hour, and I want to be aware that it's a few minutes before 1 o'clock in the afternoon here in Maine. And so I'd like to do a little bit of a wrap up here. One was Matt and I talked about maybe doing a site visit at some point in the winter or in the spring. And so everybody who signed up for this program will get an invitation to that visit in Bath. And I'm sure the Bath City Council would like to have us there too, just to see what you're working on. And E2 Tech Council, we're a nonprofit organization. We've got members all over the state and also out of state. And so if you're not a member, please consider joining as an individual or a company member. And you can reach out to Jackie or me through email or give us a call at 207-800-TECH. And Matt, do you have some closing comments you'd like to share with the group?
No, just again, thank you for the time, for the good questions, and it's been great having you here. I appreciate it.
Okay, so thanks so much, and I appreciate your participation with us today.
Thank you. And I think one other thing, I mean, there's a bunch of questions popping up here. If you would like to shoot me an email, my contact information is Matt with 2 T's at muddyriverfarm.org.
Yeah, and we can also stay on a bit longer, but I don't want to keep people on beyond the end of the hour, because that was what we had said. So if Matt's willing to stay on longer and have smaller conversations, we can certainly do those.
Sure. I've got about 15 minutes before my next commitment. James, do you have a question?
James, are you raising your hand to talk, or are you saying goodbye? Goodbye.
All right. All right, questions.
There we go. So we had 50 people participated, Matt. So
cool.
A
Excellent.
good turnout. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
We all met our goal, and I'm hopeful that E2 Tech and the University of Maine and Susan's program can figure out how to help other companies and other entrepreneurs who want to do something similar. Julia, do you have a question?
Are you saying bye, or you have a question?
I have a question, if I may, please.
Sure.
I'm with the Bangor Daily News, and this is this is so interesting and so intriguing. And I don't want to sound like I'm constantly repeating myself, but I am intrigued by the whole notion of temperature and, what the different area where certain oysters are and how the flavor, and you talked about finishing them off. And what's going to happen when, and it's sadly, I think it's going to be when, not if, the waters do get too warm for the oysters to be happy out in the Gulf. And you said we're moving to indoor. Are we just going to end up like bland, every oyster tasting alike, or what's going to, and how do you see this helping with like either mitigating what's going on, or is that like almost like two different things at this point?
So I think Matt Parker had pointed out that temperature, as it gets warmer, can actually benefit growth at times. The other issues that come with warmer temperature is you might have more explosions of algae, which then decrease the dissolved oxygen in the water, could lead to suffocation events. This happened in Brunswick last summer, I believe it was, or the summer before. There have been a couple of large algae blooms up there that have severely impacted some of the resource. So when you have less oxygen in the water, obviously you have an issue with suffocation. So it's not just temperature writ large, it's the impacts that warmer temperature might have on the surrounding environment. In terms of bringing stuff inside, I've had a couple of friends say I should dump some Jack Daniels into the tank and see if I can make some designer oysters. but in terms of the flavor, I mean, the water is still going to remain cold or colder on the bottom, or more steady on the bottom, we'll put it that way. And I mean, I can't speak to this in any way, shape, or form, but I know for many years now, there's been a process at the federal level to figure out how to permit offshore, like way offshore aquaculture. I don't believe the feds have a permitting process for it yet, but it's been in process for quite some time. And that may be part of that solution. That's just speculation on my part.
So you're saying we can dump our used coffee grounds in your tank and have coffee infused flavored oysters?
Or cocktail sauce, right? You won't even need anything at that point.
Yeah, that's right. It may be cheaper to put in used coffee grounds than Jack Daniels.
Where do I invest in that?
So does anyone else have a question for Matt or Susan, since we're here, or for me? If not, we can close out the program today. So great. Thank you all so very much for joining us.